All right, looks like Jessica started the recording, so I think that's our signal to get going. Welcome everyone to the MindCORE seminar series. I believe information more broadly about the series will be in the chat if you're interested in the other speakers, but today we are very fortunate to have Mike Frank joining us. I will just give a brief introduction and then turn it over to him. So Dr. Michael Frank is the David and Lucille Packard Professor of Human Biology at Stanford University and Director of the Symbolic Systems Program. Dr. Frank is a leader in the field and has been a proponent of moving psychological sciences forward in terms of best practices, including open science and collaboration. So for example, Dr. Frank founded the Many Babies Consortium, which brings together researchers from around the world to conduct large-scale replications in service of advancing our knowledge of the impact of some of the most prominent findings in across development. He has earned numerous awards, among them the Troland Award from the National Academy of Sciences, and has been a Jacobs Foundation Fellow. And Dr. Frank is a wonderful example of an interdisciplinary scientist. He brings together the fields of related to language and linguistics, developmental science, and cognitive science, all of which makes him a perfect fit for this series. And I expect that many will be very interested in this work. So please give a warm virtual welcome to Dr. Frank, and I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rista, and thanks so much for having me here. I have such a warm place in my heart for UPenn Cognitive Science, especially because of an experience I had when I was in college visiting the IRCS summer program, where I just had this mind-altering, eye-opening experience of hearing all the amazing faculty, some of whom are even here today, talking about their interests, and it really got me hooked on cognitive science and played a big role in my career. So thank you for that. It's always been a model for what I thought like the kind of exciting summer opportunity for an undergraduate should be. So I'm very pleased to share with you today a little bit of my and my collaborators' work using bigger data sets to study children, to investigate children's language learning at scale. Can you let me know maybe in the chat if you're seeing my screen sharing appropriately? Great. All right. So I probably don't have to remind this audience, but just to common ground how important language learning is as one of the key puzzles of cognitive science. There's just this amazing transformation from speechless, wordless infants to children who just a few years later can use language to make their way in the world. Every typically developing child makes this transition. My son is actually making that transition outside the door of my study right now. But the processes that underlie this transition are not well understood. And a better understanding of these processes is actually both important for scientific theory and clinical progress. It's also likely to enable the development of better speech technologies that can better adapt to the idiosyncrasies of our communication and context. Language explodes onto the scene. So this is my daughter, Madeline, at 18 months. The longest thing she'd said at this point was happy bee, which I think meant happy birthday. We're obsessed with holidays around here. At 19 months, she said blue ball and combined words for the first time. I was a very proud psycholinguist parent. By 23 months, she was starting to say things that I had never thought about. So she said, spike doggy, no food, eat dirt. And she was talking about my mother-in-law's dog and observing, he's a little chihuahua, that he actually doesn't eat food, he just eats dirt, which maybe is true. Finally, by 26 months, she's just a couple pounds heavier. Her hair is a little bit longer. She's got a little bit more dirt on her face. But already she's expressing herself in this really complex compositional way. She's saying, Dada, move own body, might need a little bit more space. Already starting to sound like a teenager. So when we go to our textbooks for an explanation of this explosion, we get something that looks a lot like a redescription of the data, an ages and stages model. Rather than providing a proposal about the underlying mechanisms, we see these discrete stages that describe the specific phenomena and categorizations of these phenomena into age-linked groups. But this doesn't tell us why children learn or when they fail to. Even when we go to the peer-reviewed literature, we see descriptions of individual well-studied phenomena that are maybe posited to be key in the process, but we don't have mechanistic models that really connect these things. So just to point out that this lack of theory leads to lost opportunities. Many of you may be familiar with a now classic study by Hart and Risley suggesting that differences in children's vocabulary growth might be driven in part by socioeconomic status. This study has launched hundreds of follow-ups, and not all of them have found the same striking effect sizes, but the general conclusion, I believe, is robust, at least on an observational level. And this study has inspired just a tremendous amount of work in policy and intervention. But the thing that was really striking to me, as somebody trying to build theories of early language development, was that none of that policy and intervention work really leveraged the kind of theoretical understanding that we think we are trying to build for the processes of language acquisition. This feels like a big lost opportunity. We want to predict and explain variability in children's language learning, and that should be a key goal for our theory going forward. Especially because everybody has more or less the same vague theory in mind. And George Kaczorgis and I have been working on this, we call it a standard model for language learning, which is roughly the idea that language accumulates from input, both child-directed and overheard. It's processed in the moment by the child, and then leads to some measurable behavioral outcomes in both comprehension and production. Right? So that process of accumulation is a centerpiece of many cognitive models of language acquisition, but hasn't been synthesized into a framework that allows for predicting variability and reasoning about the sources of variability and the sources of changes in the language acquisition process. In part, that's because we really haven't been able to put this theory in contact with data. So not to say that folks have not been trying. In my and others' previous work, we've really tried to take steps towards building formal theories. In my work, I focused primarily on vocabulary learning, the process of mapping a word to an object, using social cues, using cross-situational co-occurrence, and so forth, trying to figure out this process. And in my dissertation, actually, I made a very small-scale model. This is a computational framework for thinking about how a child or an ideal agent might connect these words with objects, perhaps by reasoning about the intentions of the speaker. By some measures, this area of research was very successful, I think. There were a number of models from different frameworks that had slightly competing assumptions, but covered much of the same data. There were connectionist models, kind of procedural models, some developed even by folks here at Penn. So I think this literature was productive and interesting and led to some progress. And yet, in another way, it really falls short. If we think about our learning models here as scientific hypotheses about learning, we can test and evaluate them and compare them. But when we consider what is being used to test and evaluate, I think we fall short. In my dissertation work, the input was a few hours of annotated video. In some other follow-up work, there's been more data, but mostly it's been artificial data rather than naturalistic data. And the outcomes I evaluated on were a handful of binary experimental results. Things like, at 18 months, toddlers do X, p less than 0.05. And as I tried to scale up my modeling work and cover more of the literature, I became convinced that this simply wasn't a sufficient regime, that we needed more data. Now, I wasn't the only one thinking this, far from it. While I was having this set of realizations, it was becoming clear that AI is fueled in large part, artificial intelligence is fueled in large part by data. And AI can grow in leaps and bounds when the appropriate data are available. The availability of huge resources like web crawls for language models or ImageNet for computer vision models means that AI has just sprung forward in the past 10 years. Unfortunately, modern AI models are very data intensive, and adapting these and using them as tools for thinking about scientific hypotheses in child language acquisition has been difficult because we simply don't have the data sets. Now, part of this is a matter of the different scales that we're talking about. So just to give you a sense here, for these dots, each of these dots represents, these gray dots represents 50 million words of training input. So this screen now represents what GPT-3, a formerly state-of-the-art large language model, requires. So that's 500 billion words of training data. The little half circle there in red, that's your average 2-year-old, or maybe a slightly even above average 2-year-old with 25,000 words. Might be as few as 5 or 10, or 25 million words, 5 or 10 million words for a kid who's hearing less language at home. So that's 20, 30, 40,000 times less data required for a 2-year-old than a language model. So what I think of as my goal here is to think about how we might evaluate learning models on children's learning inputs and outcomes. Think about the effectiveness of data within the regime that children are learning in. What data would we use to evaluate children's models on children's learning? And so that's the focus of my current research program and the focus of this talk. My lab builds resources for thinking about evaluating models as well as building models. So when we think about children's language input, we've used head-mounted cameras to try to gather egocentric video about children's experiences. We've also tried to help build on some of the foundational resources on our field, like the Child Language Data Exchange System. So we have a tool called Childis DB that allows easy access and reproducible analysis of Childis. Then we're starting to archive data about children's language processing as well in a new tool that I'll talk about called PeakBank. And finally, we are thinking about the outcomes of learning in observed behaviors like production and comprehension. And there we have an archive called WordBank. So we can arrange these resources into a predictive framework for fitting models. In some sense, both Childis DB and Secam are input data that would go into our hypotheses about learning mechanisms. And then PeakBank and WordBank measure outcomes, both proximal and distal, of that learning input. And so this becomes then an organizing framework for what I want to tell you about today. So I'll begin by talking about our input resources and some of the things that we've done with them. So Childis is an amazing archive. I'm sure most of you are familiar with it. The Child Language Data Exchange System archives nearly all of the transcripts of parents and kids talking, as well as other related media. This is really the original big data for child language in a shared research environment with open tools and resources. So this is really just an incredible model for open science practice, long before big data or open science were buzzwords or things that funders wanted us to adopt. So just a huge admiration for Brian McWhinney and his colleagues for building this resource and maintaining it. In our work, what we've tried to do is to create an interface to Childis that allows flexible programmatic access to the transcripts in Childis, that allows them to be pulled into processing pipelines that allow them to be kind of hooked up nicely and easily to natural language processing, and that obviate some of the pre-processing challenges that many folks have when they work on child language. So our idea is to really ease access to child language resources for folks on the natural language processing and AI side who want to use these in their models as part of their evaluation process. So that's just a brief note about Childis DB, but I want to spend a moment more on another resource for learning about children's input that we're very excited about. So after a fairly epic process that started back in 2013, we recently released the Secam dataset. This is a dataset of egocentric videos. It's collected by from three children of developmental psychologists, all authors on the paper. So we had begun working with the egocentric video method in my own lab, and I started talking to a couple of these folks. And they said, well, we're having kids. Why don't we come and do a longitudinal study and get some really valuable data about how egocentric video, how the egocentric perspective changes over time. And so with each of these kids, we collected 2 hours a week of video from around 6 months to around 30 months for more than 400 hours of video. Now, critically, also, these video are cleared for sharing and distribution. They're distributed on Databrary, and that allows us to make them reusable by folks making computer vision models, by folks interested in analyzing the input, by folks doing statistical learning models, and so forth. So the idea is to make an open resource that accelerates the use of developmental data in a wide variety of models for both scientific and AI applications. They also have some fairly rich metadata, thanks to extensive work by Jess Sullivan, who led a grant on this. There's annotations of context, some speech transcriptions, activity transcriptions, and so forth. And the egocentric video perspective has been a really interesting one for developmental science. Many of you may have been aware of the pioneering work by folks like Linda Smith and Chen Yu and Karen Adolph and their collaborators, where we find that there's some kind of striking differences between egocentric video and third-person video. So here's just a clip from Secam. I've turned the sound off because it's the typical chaos of children's life. You can see some of the observations that Smith and Adolph and their collaborators have made are on display here. Objects really impinge on the visual field much more when you are small and close to the floor and your arms are short. And the viewpoint is much more chaotic than one might expect, thinking about an adult's relatively stable, higher up viewpoint. So this really changes the nature of the learning problem in some interesting ways. So I'll just tell you about one example of the synergy between this kind of data collection and uses in AI. This is a collaboration with Chung-Shu Shuang and Dan Yeamans. They are some computational neuroscientists and machine learning folks who've been developing unsupervised models for learning visual representations. Their models learn what are called contrastive embeddings. These are representations that are optimized to maximize the similarity of related images while minimizing the similarity of distinct images. So they're methods for trying to learn good representational bases from data in an unsupervised way. And I think a lot of people think these unsupervised methods more broadly are really the way forward for computer vision modeling. So in this recent paper, a group of us led by Chung-Shu used Secam, this data set that I was just showing you, to train a variant of these algorithms that's optimized for video instance embeddings. And so we used all of the Secam examples here as our training backdrop. And the hypothesis that we're testing is that using more naturalistic video, even though it's a kind of relatively small data set, 400 hours is not very much by modern computer vision standards, that using this naturalistic video would actually give us traction on learning good representations, which then could be compared downstream to things like neural data. And that's precisely what we found, that these unsupervised methods, when used on Secam, actually performed decently well in correlating with brain data from IT. Now, we didn't quite beat the supervised models or even the unsupervised on the much larger ImageNet data set, but kind of per piece of data, we performed remarkably well, I think. So there's fairly strong neural prediction results despite the, quote, small size of this corpus. And I think this paper, this result, has opened up a hunger in their group as well as a number of other groups for a larger data set that really could compete with the computer vision data sets by virtue of its naturalism and by virtue of its size. So that's what we're up to right now. My lab is hard at work on a new baby view data set. So in order to get that baby view data set collected, what we're doing is working with a design firm, Daylight Design, to develop a brand new headcam prototype. Previous headcam videos, as you've seen, are limited in part by the view angle of the cameras, in part by some kind of physical constraints of the devices, battery life, resolution, and so forth. And so what we're trying to do is get something that's much, much more naturalistic. So let me show you here. This is a GoPro with a rotated aspect ratio. So now you have a much broader vertical field of view, much closer to the actual human field of view. This is our designer and her family. Her infant daughter is wearing this. And you can see we actually start to get much more of the social context of the child's hands and the face of the parent and so forth in this view, combined with accelerometer data, much richer gyroscope data, and much better, higher quality video here. This device is designed for 6 to 30-month-olds or 6 to 36-month-olds. We find it's better tolerated than other camera solutions that are kind of more obvious to the child. It's integrated with a child crash helmet. This is a helmet that's sold on Amazon for kids who are just learning to walk to protect their heads, and it's actually quite comfy and flexible and lightweight. So we're very close to making this design publicly available, along with a preprint, and actually we've found a firm that's willing to build these to order. So if there are developmental scientists or other folks interested in egocentric video from kids on the call, feel free to get in touch. One of our goals is to really try to bring some standardization to this sensor landscape so that folks can be collecting video that's more comparable and more useful for the broader set of applications. Okay, next moving on to our data about children's outcomes. So just showed you a little bit of the data that we have about inputs. Now we're talking about measuring children's behavior to evaluate the outcomes from learning models. And then in the last part of the talk, I'll try to move on and connect these up through some initial work on learning models. So the first project tracking children's outcomes at scale that we conducted took advantage of a very wonderful instrument for studying child language. That's the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventory. The MBCDI, or the CDI for short, is a parent report form where parents bubble in, basically check off the words that their child either says or says and understands. So this is Madeline at 12 months. Of course, she had a very limited production at that time, but we believe that she understood many more words, and so the CDI is one tool for capturing this. Despite the parent report format, CDI is one of the standard measures for measuring early child language. It kind of nicely trades off between being low cost and being surprisingly reliable and valid. So if your other options are a very expensive and time-consuming transcription session, or a behavioral measure that only measures an outcome on a small number of words, the CDI actually is a pretty good trade-off, and it's widely used as a screener in clinical applications as well. For that reason, it's been adapted, not translated, but actually adapted to the specific language and needs of different communities for over 100 languages, and there are strong norms for maybe half of that. And that provides a really exciting data opportunity that we took advantage of. So these groups around the world had collected data on their own localized MBCDI adaptation, and we asked them to deposit those data in a database that we built for this purpose. That's called WordBank. So WordBank is this open database that has CDI data from around the world. We now have data for more than 75,000 children, 29 languages or dialects, with about 5 more about to come in the next release. And some of these are very overrepresented. Of course, we've got really big, wonderful data sets, for example, from the Norwegian group, who were pioneers in online administration. But we also have Kiswahili and Kigiriama data sets. We've got American Sign Language and British Sign Language, and we're about to roll out some bilingual data sets. So we're really starting to gather a broad set of data on children's language outcomes across many different learning scenarios and many different cultural and linguistic contexts. And this kind of resource can be really interesting for exploring children's vocabulary outcomes. So here's just an example of using our online tools. So say you're interested in looking at sex differences. You pick the German data set, which is a pretty reasonably big one, and language production. And you can split this by gender or sex. And you can recover the fairly well-known female advantage here. And now you could check for example, the cross-cultural reliability of that, and we see it's there in Korean, and maybe there in Swedish as well. So this is just one example of the kind of exploration you can do online. You can also pull in these data through an R package, word banker, that allows you to programmatically manipulate the data in a reproducible way. And so for the last number of years, actually, my group has been exploring these data. So in a collaboration with Mika Brzezinski, Dan Yurovsky, and Virginia Marchman, we have written a book now out from MIT Press called Variability and Consistency in Early Language Learning. This project was essentially applying all of the analyses that are out there in the literature that had been applied to the MBCDI in individual data sets. and bringing those together and applying them systematically across all of the data sets in WordBank. So I could go on and on about this book. There's a whole lot of interesting stuff that I think came out of it, but I'll just summarize the 3 key cross-linguistic generalizations that we make in the conclusion, which I think are kind of interesting and maybe were a little bit surprising to me. The first was that we find that the language system is tightly woven. That is, it didn't have to be the case that parts of language like morphology, grammatical complexity, and vocabulary and gesture all correlate together within individuals, but in point of fact, they do, and those correlations are extremely robust and strong across languages. So that suggests that within individuals, these capacities are tied together, which I think provides an interesting constraint on mechanisms. Second generalization is that children's similar interests drive their communication. So the content of what kids talk about in their earliest vocabulary is surprisingly similar across countries and across languages. And I think that suggests that children, by virtue of their social world and their attention and interest, drive early language and the content of vocabulary. And the third generalization was, I think, especially surprising to me, that beyond the huge variation in rate of language learning, there is also variation in style. There's a complex landscape of variability here where some children learn faster and acquire more nouns and tend to more quickly establish what got called in the literature a referential style, and others tend to learn a little slower, tend to say more complex sentences earlier relative to vocabulary, and tend to have what's in the literature called an expressive style. And these differences were quite robust across languages as well, suggesting a real axis of variation in language learning. Okay, there's much more I could say about this, but instead of continuing, I will encourage you to check out the WordBank book, which is available for free online at wordbank-book.stanford.edu, as well as being available in print from MIT Press. The final outcome measure that I want to talk about here is what's sometimes known as the looking while listening measure. This was first developed as the inframodal preferential looking paradigm, but really developed by my colleague and mentor, Anne Fernald. This is a measure of children's language processing that takes advantage of the fact that children will look at a named referent. So when you say, look at the ball, or look at the cookie, or look at the book, children's eye movements, and adults as well, of course, will move to the named referent with a fairly consistent time course. And across numerous studies of looking while listening, you find consistent relationships. And these data, this is a data set from Kyle McDonald, a former graduate student with me and Anne Fernald, and some wonderful work he did on the time course of looking to American Sign Language utterances. And so this utterance is find the ball, and you see in ASL speakers these time-locked proportion of looks to the target going up. This is for adults in blue, very quickly, and then gradually coming down, and then slower for older children in green and younger children in red. And this general correlation of accuracy and reaction time with age and with vocabulary is very consistent across populations: Spanish and English speakers of lower and higher SES, late talkers, premature kids, bilinguals, and so forth, as well as links between vocabulary and reaction time and developmental changes in reaction time. So there's a really kind of a very consistent picture that emerges from many different studies using this paradigm. Now, again, because I'm telling you about all this consistency in the literature, you might now hear echoes of what we said about WordBank, that presents an opportunity for data aggregation across the many different instances of this paradigm that are used with different stimuli, different eye trackers or different tracking methods, and across different labs. And that's precisely what we've been working on. So we are aggregating together developmental word recognition eye tracking data sets in a site we call PeakBank. This is quite a new project. So it was just presented at the Cognitive Science Conference this year, and it's a result of a massive effort by many folks, led currently by Martin Zetterston at Princeton. So through a set of hackathons over several years, we all gathered together first in person and then on Zoom to develop the workflow that goes from the broad set of raw data sets here through the data import process, common formatting for eye tracking data, common analytic decisions, creation of a database, and then a set of API and visualization tools so that folks can interact with this data in an easy to use format. And we have a paper and preprint under review now, which details this if you're interested in using these data or contributing. Just to give you a quick flavor for what these sorts of data look like. This is the word recognition curve, the same one that I showed you, but varying across items across 15 different data sets here. We're now up to maybe about 20. You can see this general rise in accuracy that differs based on the age of the kids in the data set and the difficulty and the number of items. You can see that some of these have tremendous numbers of items and are very variable, whereas others have small numbers of items, for example, and are extremely consistent. So again, this presents an opportunity for making generalizations across data sets and across age, and that's something that we've just begun to do with this data set. So here's just a very, very first result that I am excited about at the moment. These are growth curves now for word recognition across different ages, where you average across all of the data in our data set. And if you look at this, I think this looks kind of a little bit gross in some sense. These curves don't look very well behaved. The younger kids and the 1-year-olds and the 2-year-olds are kind of on top of each other. The 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds are on top of each other. So just averaging across this highly variable data set doesn't get you what you want. But if you start to put these into a mixed effects model that's really controlling for lab to lab, study to study, item to item, participant to participant variation, you can start to extract out predicted latent curves for word recognition. And that's, I think, much more exciting because you can start to estimate this increase in speed and accuracy that you see across children's development. And you can see also that increase starts to decelerate with age as kids reach somewhat closer to an adult asymptote. And so you can really start to characterize the process of increasing speed and accuracy in processing that might be interpretable as part of this broader standard model where language is heard, processed, and learned. All right. So now let me transition to the very last part of this talk, talking about hypotheses about learning mechanisms and the first steps that we're taking to try to connect between these resources. Let me begin by showing you my inspiration here, which is from a project that I worked on beginning in graduate school, actually, this human speechome project of Deb Roy and his collaborators. Just to note here that there's actually 2 Roys involved. One is Brandon Roy, who was the graduate student who led all of this work. The other is Deb. They're unrelated. It's just a coincidence of last name. So for those of you that don't know the Human Speechome Project, this was a really immensely ambitious project that Deb Roy led at the MIT Media Lab right before the birth of his first son. He wired his house for video and audio and collected, over the first 3 years of his son's life, 200 terabytes worth of video data. Then Brandon spent his entire PhD working out the transcription system for this. So he eventually ended up working with more than 60 transcribers, using custom transcription tools to get almost 9 million words of what they called child available speech in the home. Here's just a view of a day in the life here, of course, sped up by a lot as the lights go on. And you see that the privacy shutters while everybody's getting dressed, then everybody goes to work, the child putters around, takes a nap, wakes up, people come home, start to have meals, get ready for bed, put the child to bed, and then the lights go out. So just a tremendous resource here. And as we started to think about the relations between the child's input and the child's learning, we drew on this predictive framework that had been first really pioneered by Goodman, Dale, and Lee, where you connect between input and learning using regression models. And the idea was that we were trying to use all of the different features of these words that the child experienced to predict the age of the first production for the words. And we added frequency and the length of the word, the length of the utterances for the word, as well as features about the distribution in the home and time and in space and in linguistic contexts to try to make predictions about which words were learned earlier and later. Now, of course, we didn't make perfect predictions here. We couldn't predict, for example, that the child's first word was fish. That was predicted to be learned later in the model and so forth. But this regression format allowed us to take a number of different information sources and estimate their weights in connecting between the input that we had measured and this particular outcome, which was word-by-word variation in difficulty of production. So what I've been doing in my lab recently is taking this age of acquisition prediction task and using that as the predictive model to link between input and outcomes. So this is the first paper in this line by Mika Brzezinski, who just graduated from MIT. It's coming back to Stanford as a postdoc. So in their work, Mika took the acquisition trajectories of around 400 words. This is from the word bank data. So looking at how easy dog was to learn, for example, in English, how easy jump was, and then looking across 10 different languages using hand-mapped translation equivalents to try to figure out whether dog or jump was easier across these languages. So this now gives us a predictive model. It's not really yet a learning model, but it's a predictive model that could go, for example, between the frequency estimates for each of these languages in Childis and the acquisition trajectory for these words from WordBank. So this is not a child-by-child prediction. In fact, aside from the Roy data, we really don't have data sets that allow that kind of child-by-child, word-by-word prediction. But it is the beginnings of connection between input and outcome. And so when we examine these regression coefficients, we put in a number of different predictors here, from frequency, number of phonemes, length of words. We see a kind of an interpretable and interesting pattern. Higher frequency words are learned earlier, shorter words are produced earlier, and so forth. I won't interpret those too much, but I think the most exciting result from me in this paper was that the regression coefficients, that pattern, actually was really very similar across languages. So much more than a random baseline, the regression coefficient strengths were correlated across languages, suggesting that across 10 languages, the same information sources appear to matter for learners, at least at kind of the highest level of description. And so a lot of what my lab is doing these days is really trying to flesh out these predictive models, adding more sophisticated and more detailed predictors into them to try to evaluate whether, for example, morphological complexity of the language is a predictor here, or whether we can add more data about the sources of frequency. That's a paper that we just submitted the other day. So really trying to use this regression model as a backdrop for evaluating different models. Let me show you just one of these examples. This is a picture from Abdella Fortassi's work. So Abdella was a postdoc in the lab, now is a faculty member in Marseille. And he took a lexical networks approach that was pioneered by Thomas Hills and his collaborators to try to look at the growth of lexical networks in the word bank data. So you can see this is early vocabulary and the connectedness of words. As the vocabulary grows, you can see different knots around animals and clothes and so forth. And as the vocabulary gets larger, that structure becomes more and more elaborated. You can browse around these on the word bank site if you're interested in exploring these networks. And you can form these networks using edges that are derived from semantic structure, like word embeddings from a word vector space semantics model called Word2Vec. You can also do this with phonological structure, so the number of phonemes different between each word. And each of these network structures has been, in previous work with smaller data sets, suggested to have some role in acquisition. And so what Abdella did was put these into the same predictive framework that we had created in the previous work. and found that network geometry, the meaning relations, and actually also the phonological relations, appears to predict age of acquisition over and above the prior model, suggesting that there were components of relatedness between words that were driving acquisition over and above things like frequency, concreteness, utterance length, and so forth. And our future work really revolves around using this method that leverages these large resources to try to evaluate different sources of information and different models of learning. All right, so wrapping up here, I argued today that the building theories of child language requires better data resources. And I showed you how a lot of our effort goes towards trying to create these resources. These resources not only enable new science, which was my focus here, but they can also interface with new unsupervised models in AI, and they form a really interesting resource for considering whether certain AI algorithms are, for example, sufficient to produce patterns of behavior from a certain size data set. Finally, trying to connect between these resources to create predictive models of early language, I think, is a really promising framework for better understanding and synthesizing our theories of child language acquisition. Okay, thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to taking your questions.
Thanks so much. So if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand, or you can also put a question into the chat, which we will monitor. As people are kind of forming their thoughts, I'll start with a then less formed thought or question for you, which is I thought that was a really interesting point when you were talking about the word bank book, about the similarity of interests among children and how that's driving their communication. I'd be interested to hear you talk a little bit more about what some of those interests are, and if you're thinking about or have some ideas about, especially how the webcam data might, show us those interests in a really illustrative way. And then, maybe even help us make predictions about the communication trajectories or the trajectories of those interests coming online.
Yeah, great question. So I'm just going to read out the 10 earliest words that children produce in English just for fun. They're bottle, daddy, mommy, the child's own name, bye, no, peekaboo, hi, dog, and ball. And now I'll just for fun read out the Norwegian top 10. Child's own name, mommy, daddy, bye, hi, peekaboo, no, yum yum, good night, and grandma. And that's true for Mandarin as well and Korean as well. Here are the Korean ones: food, daddy, mommy, peekaboo, no, dirty, bath, ball, cracker, water. So a little different. So we have a variety of different ways of quantifying that similarity, but if you just eyeball these big lists, they're very similar to one another. So what do we see? We see people. The kind of representation of people varies across the, whether your culture tends to have extended family hanging out in your house a lot, but there are definitely some people on there. There are small objects and animals, and there are games and social routines: hi, bye, no, peekaboo, these sorts of things. And I guess I like to think of, so there's a couple different null hypotheses that you can compare to this, because of course that's what babies say. Like that is like in some sense unsurprising. I'm just telling you a thing that anybody who has a baby knows. But okay, so null hypothesis one, it could be frequency. Frequency could win the day, and then baby's first words would be the, of, and, it, or something like that. Or even frequency in nouns, and it wouldn't show up being these. It would be like time, some, thing. These sorts of words. That's not what shows up. So it's clearly not those words. So frequency doesn't do all of the job, especially for the very first words. It's very important for later words. A second null hypothesis is like the basic needs hypothesis, right? It could really be like milk, diaper, sleep, these sorts of things, like take care of me kinds of words. And that also doesn't show up. Kids do communicate about that stuff. Certainly, but that it doesn't form the kind of core of their early vocabulary. And so for me, this makes me lean towards theories like Tomasello's about the kind of critical role of social sharing and affiliation in early use of language. And so that's kind of where I come down on this. But one of the wonderful things about the word bank data and the terrible things about the word bank data is it's just a lot of observational data, and so it is an interesting constraint on theories, but it doesn't test theories directly. This correlational data, and so we can speculate a lot about what's going on there, and think about whether there are natural or lab experiments that test these hypotheses. Just to address your last point about using headchem data on this, I think that's an extremely interesting possibility that we might be able to better advance our baseline models beyond the kind of intuitive ones that I just stated by running associative models on these complex multimodal data sets. And if cats and dogs and parents and routines show up as important in there under different kinds of loss functions, that might be interesting and indicative, as well as if they don't, right? If the associative models still are coming up with table and chair as the most interesting things, that would be a nice indictment of those models. So,
very cool.
So yeah,
thank you.
Yeah, Dan, go ahead.
Thanks, Mike. This was a really great and very clear presentation of what's been really a phenomenal amount of work, and I'm glad you were able to present it to this audience. I really enjoyed this. I have a question for you about the future. So I think I have a sense of where the near future is going to be on the input side. We'll have much better video, better audio, and maybe just as importantly, we'll have automatic tagging of objects and words and so on. So I think we're going to have, in short order, really, really good and more comprehensive input data. So my question for you is, what do you think the future is on the outcome side? So what do we need that we don't have? We certainly have tons of parental vocabulary data and there's a lot that remains to be explored in that. We have two picture fixation experiments. What do you think about when you think about the future of the outcome side?
Yeah, it's a fabulous question. So, there's kind of two options. There's a branching, more or different. And I'm still on the more train right now. I totally get why folks are going for different sometimes, but let me tell you about where I see more going. And in particular, look, this predictive modeling thing is getting us somewhere, but there's also something profoundly weird about what we call the mega child approach. That is, you string together everything in Childis and you string together everything in Word Bank and you link them up. So what we're trying to do now is break that down just a little bit. So we're starting to break down bilinguals by amount of exposure. We're starting to break down frequency sources by socioeconomic status, more books, fewer books. And that's where our modeling work is going. And that's the kind of next set of analyses that aren't quite finished, but are looking promising. But really what we want to be doing is predicting for individual kids. And that's going to require dense measurement. And I think the future of dense measurement is automatic internet-based and app-based measurement, and that's where we're trying to go. So for the past future, we've been saying it's the future for the past 5 years. We've been working on this app called Wordful, which Stefan Malin has led along with Mika Brzezinski. Wordful is what comes after the CDI. It's an adaptive journaling mechanism that allows you to very quickly log appropriate words from a kind of suggested list that grows adaptively and kind of responsively for the kid. So you go in and you swipe left or right, kind of Tinder style, on the words that your child knows or doesn't know. And you can journal idiosyncratic words you can add to the list. The list is bigger than the CDI and so forth. So that's the parent report side to try to track things on a day-to-day level or week-to-week level rather than a month-to-month or year-to-year level. And we ran a preliminary norming study with a couple hundred folks that used this app for a month, and they liked it, they used it, and it matched up with the CDI. Technically, Victor, it's for the parents. So we're still entertaining the parents on their app rather than the kids themselves. But we are, also thinking about trying to sync that up with the Lookit platform, which I think is really the future of developmental testing. So Laura Schultz and Melissa Klein and I have been working together on a large proposal to track kids through the Lookit platform using new automated eye gaze coding software, Eyecatcher from Casey Lou Williams' lab, trying to get looking while listening, again, to be more of a longitudinal repeated measure in a kind of simple, quick, easy to administer online session. Now, all of this is in some sense pie in the sky, but really what we want to do is get these kind of dense measurements to try to understand the process within kids, because models of within kid change are where we're going to really differentiate theoretical hypotheses, I think. That, we can narrow down information sources across kids to a certain extent, but within kid is where the eventual action will be.
Thanks.
Hi, Anna.
Hi, Mike. Beautiful talk. I want to second what Dan has said about the, transformational new data and really new approaches here. I also have, my question is almost like a follow-up to some of the themes that have been raised. So I was wondering about the things that enter into the models, right? And where they come from and how we should think about them moving forward. What are the things we could add? What are the constraints on the models we build? And some of the things that are in the models are very straightforward and very, obvious and interesting, like gender of the speaker, things that you can code very straightforwardly. And then there's other things like imageability, which start getting us into really different territory and involve different kinds of decisions, and very quickly take us into a conversation about even what's observable in a context versus not, right? Dog is not observable perhaps to the same degree as animal is. There's different levels of abstraction. So I was just wondering about what your thoughts are as you're beginning to, build different models, test different hypotheses, constraints on these properties that we're going to be looking at. A bunch of really good questions.
Thank you for the question. Yeah, and you're quite right to point out in a very kind way that I've labeled this box in the middle learning models, but that's an aspirational label. A regression model is a pile of predictors. There's no learning happening in that model in the sense of a cognitive model of the child. So I think that's really that's something I should emphasize more in clarifying this. So what we're doing right now is looking at different information sources, and those information sources have radically different status as per what an individual kid might have access to. So frequency, we're trying to measure some proxy for what the child is experiencing in their environment, with greater or lesser fidelity, bias, and variance, and so forth. For number of phonemes, I think that's a pretty easy one. That's a pretty good proxy for being hard to say, just because by virtue of being long and hard to articulate. It's not perfect, but it gets you somewhere. But then there's all these conceptual factors that have been argued to be very important in the literature. And what we really want to say is, how hard was it for our learning model to individuate this object and map it across different tokens to be a concept and so forth? And we don't have any way to pose that the way things are set right now. So what we end up doing is using psycholinguistic norms on things like imageability and concreteness and so forth. And those norms are reliable and valid, and also a very odd adult-based proxy for the thing that we really want. So where does that go in the short term? I don't know. Because in the short term, our learning models, we're starting to bring in learning models as predictors, but they're mostly on the text and occasionally audio signal. They're not, we tried some stuff extracting prosody and prosodic patterns. And so you could try to bring learning models in here, but on the conceptual side, I don't want to be stuck with these proxies. They're not right, but they're decent, and then they allow us to put some kind of conceptual predictors in the models that go beyond just just what we can extract from the speech signal. So the long game is, of course, to get these out of the headcam data, but I'm not after 10 years of holding my breath for computer vision to catch up with the kind of data that we have, I'm not holding my breath yet. We're starting to do this stuff, but getting out reliable predictors from computer vision maybe still a number of years yet. Maybe I should take a question from the chat here from Vida, who writes, thank you for a really excellent talk. Thank you. And I'm wondering to what extent illuminating these common mechanisms of language acquisition can help explain and design interventions for neurodivergent children who struggle to acquire language. For example, autistic children. That's a fabulous question. I think there's a couple of different intersections here. The first I want to point out is measurement. The better we characterize language acquisition across different populations, and the better we understand its relation to a variety of different sociodemographic factors and language environment factors, the better we can measure those trajectories. So we've already done some of that work with the MacArthur CDI, which is routinely used as a language screener. So what we've been doing is, one, building on prior work on adaptive testing and for vocabulary to roll out a very nice, well, I say it's very nice. I think you should be convinced that it's a good 1 to 3 year old adaptive parent report language test that takes about 25 to 50 questions and gives you a pretty reliable and valid measure of the child's percentile. And that can be adjusted to various different demographic groups and maybe in a little while to their language environment, so whether they're bilingual at home and so forth. And that gives you much better early language screening, which is an important form of early identification for kids with developmental disorders. So measurement is kind of one place where I think this doesn't help you necessarily intervene yet, but it's really a contribution of the basic science here. The second contribution is by thinking about mechanism and thinking about how the mechanism plays out across the vocabulary. I think we can get much more detailed predictions around what's changing in the process of vocabulary acquisition. So that's work that we've just begun, but Abdella Fortassi has been using many of the analyses that we did in the Word Bank book on typically developing children, because most of our Word Bank data have, by virtue of being kind of normative data, have excluded neurodivergent kids, at least those that had diagnoses at time of data collection. But we're now applying those same analyses to where they're available data sets of kids on the autism spectrum who have CDI reports. And so you can look then at not just, okay, is vocabulary growing at the right rate, but also sort of more complex signatures, like are there more nouns or verbs in the vocabulary? Are there more concrete objects? Are there more, kind of sounds and so forth? So you're really looking at the semantic structure of vocabulary. And I think that gives us a sense of how vocabulary might grow in different ways across different populations. But we're at the beginnings of that work. Okay, next, Victor.
Hi, thanks so much. Really beautiful data, and I've always loved your knack to visualize it. Extremely useful tools. I wanted to ask kind of a simple question, but I wanted, if you'll allow me some pretension, to start with a little bit of a parable. It's actually by Borges, and it's called On Exactitude in Science, and it goes, in that empire, the art of cartography attained such perfection that the map of a single province occupied the entirety of a city, and the map of the empire, the entirety of a province. In time, those unconscionable maps no longer satisfied, and the Cartographers Guild struck a map of the empire whose size was that of the empire, and which coincided point for point with it. The following generations, who were not so fond of the study of cartography as their forebears had been, saw that the vast map was useless, and not without some pitilessness that they delivered it up to the inclemencies of suns and winters. In the deserts of the West, still today, there are tattered ruins of that map, inhabited by animals and beggars. In all the land, there's no other relic of the disciplines of geography. And so my question is kind of like chasing kind of naturalistic data and chasing kind of the most data, right? When does it end or translate into the different instead of the more, I guess, right? You mentioned you're still on the more. And my question is, when do we get to the different? Because I agree with you. And again, I value so many of these tools you put together for us. But I think a lot of the questions that the field has been interested in are difficult. I mean, data aren't neutral, right? We categorize them along some dimension. And as you mentioned, right, we use these simple sort of norms, right? Like imageability, concrete, we use these proxies. And my question is, how long can we make do, right, with those proxies and keep gathering more of it? um, to get these returns, I guess. Because I do think there are returns. And again, I'm very, I love the presentation, but I think the call for more, I always, I have some friends in the tech industry and they're always talking about optimization and more data. And I always wonder, when will there ever be enough data, right? The empire of the setting sun, the empire that the sun never sets, right, is what it sounds like sometimes. And so that's what I'm wondering, I guess. At what stage do we transition from the more to the different? When does the more, is the hope that it guides us to the different, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so thanks for the really thought-provoking question and for reminding me of that beautiful Borges story. I don't think we're in danger of having a map of child language that's so beautifully detailed that it approximates the language. That would be quite a feat. So a couple of comments. First, I think you're right that data are not value neutral. No, data are not just the thing that you want more of, irrespective of what they are. What I've tried to focus on in my work and sort of treat it as a North Star is that I want to be describing the kind of ecological inputs and outcomes that really matter. So I find, the CDI is really nice because it really is what parents see of the child's language. It's their functional language, and it's a holistic map of that functional language for the child. So that really is, it is very well related to meaningful life outcomes. Actually, if we're talking about neurodivergent kids, the parent CDIs are what, they're a big predictor of whether the quality of life is high, if the child can communicate in these ways. So that's one reason to focus on CDIs, and similarly on the child's experience. Now we could a separate conversation about who those children are and how we sample and how representative that is of human experience. That's a huge concern, and it's one that we're really actively working on in this current data set. But I think that the child's own experience, again, is one of these data sets it's not just data. It is a particularly valuable kind of data that people have wanted and speculated about. When will we have enough? Well, I think one thing that we can ask is about the scale of data that's available to the child. And so I've been kind of, with some hubris, measuring the size of these corpora in terms of child years. If you think about it that way, Secam is about 8% of a child year. So when you say, can I train an AI model to the vision performance of a 3-year-old? Well, no, I can't, because I just don't have those data. So what I would like is 3 child years worth of data. And they're not going to be the right child years. They're not going to be all of their myriad experiences. It's going to be stitched together out of 10 different children. But that's the current goal. And I think that a data set of the appropriate naturalistic size, both for text data from Childis and also ideally from the video data, is really going to be the starting point for thinking about what we can reasonably expect from a particular sample. So that's kind of point 2 is there are some goals here, and they're tagged to the naturalistic situation.
Would it be fair to say that there is some desire here to provide some kind of benchmarking data set for pretty much just about anything we can imagine children do cognitively that might pertain to language, like, vision, let's say, but also audition, right? Not just the language that they hear, right? But certainly the acoustic experiences they're having, right? Or because we hear words like, that sounded tinny or something. So presumably we have to label sounds we hear as well as things we see, right? So would it be fair for me to say then that, what I interpreted that is, you would love just a really good kind of gold standard benchmark or training set that a lot of different algorithms could be tested on, a whole class that would allow us to more directly compare them to the fantastic sort of growth that children are able to exhibit compared to the child year. Algorithm years, if you're talking about child years, I'm trying to think of algorithm years, and like the full Wikipedia corpora and Project Gutenberg and everything, so is it kind of to narrow that distance between, those two in a way? That makes sense. And I guess the only question or the last thing just to follow up is, I think that, all this stuff is crucial with the individual differences and so on. I do think that there are lots of questions about who and where these children are, like you're saying, but also the kind of resilience that they show regardless of their potential variation, right? So to say that children are performing differently, you require some other assumptions to then hold one up as the standard by which others should perform at to some degree, right? It's kind of there is a normative claim to some degree when we say people are learning things later than they should, right? And so what I'm saying is, regardless of the timeline of acquisition, we do see a great resiliency, right? And so, that's just one of the puzzles that, I wonder how that could motivate more development in individual variability.
That's a fabulous point. Let me just, I'm just going to share my screen one more time. So you should now see the norms for English production. So these are the quantile curves. And I just want to point out how immensely variable kids are. So when I talk about measurement and screening and diagnosis, what I'm not talking about is saying, hey, there's one trajectory that kids should have.
Okay. Yeah.
There's a massive range of individual variation, but there are kids that are below the 5th percentile, and we want to identify that early, and we want to refer them to a speech language pathologist or to their pediatrician to have a conversation. Are they concerned about that? And so, thinking about tailoring those norms appropriately to the kid and the context is very important. So screening, early diagnosis is a really key part of good treatment, both for autism spectrum disorders, but also for other speech language issues. And so having good screening tools is a really important part of the arsenal. There are a lot of different ways that language can develop, but we want to make sure that we, when things are off track and are correctable, for example, for speech motor reasons, as well as for, other cognitive reasons, that we figure that out. And so measurement and characterization doesn't have to include normativity on, in the sense of one single trajectory, but rather a range of typical outcomes.
Thank you so much for taking those questions.
Yeah, great questions. Thanks. Mark, go ahead.
So following up on some of the earlier questions, for neurodevelopmental disorders like autism, but including others as well, an absolutely crucial need is screening and diagnosis before words appear. Diagnosing certain kinds of autism, at least at 18 months or 24 months, that better than nothing, but diagnosing them at 3, 4, 5, 6 months would be 100 times better. The problem is that in order to do that, you have to base the diagnosis on the development of pre-verbal vocalizations such as babbling. And people have known this for 50 years or more. And given that, it's absolutely tragic that dozens of years after the idea of a babble corpus was first floated, and indeed after the first privately held babble corpus was put together, there is no shared data, as far as I know, for the analysis and quantification of the development of babbling and other pre-verbal vocalizations. I think this is absolutely tragic and completely unforgivable. Not your fault, obviously, but so do you have any ideas about how to fix this?
Well, so first of all, I agree that early diagnosis and screening is certainly very interesting. Although, it's certainly an important concern. I've worked a little bit with a colleague, Dennis Wall at Stanford Medical School, who's been involved in kind of home video-based and app-based screening methods that focus less on babble and vocalization and more on kind of social responsiveness, which is one of these early signs. And that I think is, I've seen some kind of interesting and promising data from them, but there's certainly a lot of work to be done there. With respect to,
there was a multi-site collection which Penn participated in, and I've been on the thesis committee of a woman who worked on that data, which collected early language or early vocalization development information from both kids who are at risk for autism for either genomic or familial reasons, and kids who weren't, and then tracked them through to several years of age so they could tell how they came out. Tragically, they made no arrangement for sharing that data. They did not even try to get IRB approval or informed consent for sharing the data. So, I mean, even within the institutions that participated in the multi-site survey, the data can only be looked at by the people who were involved in the original survey. So anyway, I'm going to stop complaining and shut up, but I think this is a good example of what the old world used to be like, what your work represents a transformation away from. And I hope if the opportunity ever arises that you will argue to people who do this kind of stuff that maybe they should consider extending this to pre-verbal material as well.
Mark, my grandmother used to say, "From your lips to God's ear." Right. So you're absolutely, you're saying things that resonate very deeply with me about the broader need for openness and for creating these data sets in ways that not only make them in principle open, but make them easily accessible to the broadest range of computational researchers by virtue of well-designed tools that let them pull them into analyses quickly and reproducibly. So that's exactly what we need. Yesterday morning at this same time, I was on the phone with the Baby Siblings Research Consortium, BSRC, which is an autism research consortium, giving my strong pitch for why open data is key to accelerating scientific discovery and trying to advocate for some of the causes that you're describing, not for vocalization specifically, but just in general as part of the key steps towards a more cumulative developmental science that's based on the immense value of the data that's been collected. And I was really struck by an analysis by Mike Milham, who's an fMRI and data sharing researcher who had actually done the cost benefit analysis of the set of fMRI data sets, like the resting state, 1,000 resting states data set, and a set of other ones, and had an estimate that the total value of the publications, the data collection costs saved by the publications on these was on the order of $2 billion, right? So the unbelievable value saved by pooling our resources in this case is only one example of why we have to be endorsing this kind of broader sharing mentality. I didn't beat these drums during my talk. I just kind of, I have the talk where I say, transparency and openness is critical for stopping the brush fires and dumpster fires of psychological science. And I chose not to give that talk here. I just talked about the things that I personally like to do with the data. But I really appreciate your question in giving me a chance to give a full-throated endorsement of these causes.
Thank you.
All right, we are getting to the very last minute here. So I just want to take that to thank you again, Dr. Frank, for your talk and really exciting and interesting discussion. For those that are interested in these individual difference questions, there's more on that next week. So please be sure to check out our seminar series and join me in giving one last round of applause to Dr. Frank. So thanks so much.
Thank you for organizing, Rista and Jessica, and thank you for having me.